Are your glutes active? Are they underactive? Can you feel them working or not when you do an exercise? Does it even matter? This is what we're going to get into today, but first I think it's pretty clear that I'm in an entirely new room right now. This is really the gym that I've been working on building and opening the last couple of months behind the scenes, and it's coming to fruition, but we're not all the way there yet. But I wanted to film this video because I think this is something that is perpetuating the fitness industry. This is something that a lot of people care about, but ultimately I think is very much misunderstood. And the idea of glute activation is not something that is a good or bad thing. It's just something that we can understand through appreciating the biomechanics and the anatomy and how we can get into certain positions to get the outcome that we want. Let's back up a little bit and talk about what actually makes a muscle tick, what makes it activate, what makes it actually go through a contraction. Well, it first needs to stretch in order to contract. Your glutes are muscles that attach on your posterior pelvis right here. And when they contract, they create an external rotation moment at the pelvis like so. And then when they stretch, the pelvis is in more of an internally rotated position. So if we wanted to leverage the greatest ability to contract the glutes, we would need to go from an internally rotated position of the pelvis to an externally rotated position of the pelvis. You can see as the glute contracts right here, this action is going to occur. And that's exactly what we would want if we're going to recruit the most amount of glute tissue. Now let's imagine we're doing something like a hip thrust or a squat or a clamshell activity, trying to get our glutes to work as much as we can. So we squeeze them as hard as we can, and we spend a lot of time in the end range position of that joint action, of the pelvis going into external rotation. If I squeeze my glutes really hard, this is what's going to happen. That means that it's better, right? If we're feeling it work more, that means our muscle might get sore, which is a good thing, right? Not necessarily, because think about what you're actually doing if you were to constantly squeeze your butt as much as you can through an exercise or only work that muscle through an end range position. You're going to take a muscle that's already in a shortened state and you're going to try and shorten it even more. How are you going to create the tension? How are you going to create the mechanical tension necessary to have that stretch to contract principle to work the joint through a full range of motion if you're only working it in the position where you feel it the most? That's not going to lead to the most amount of muscle fibers being recruited. It's not going to lead to the most amount of breakdown possible, and that's not going to lead to you getting the intended outcome of repositioning your body or growing your glutes. The second biggest mistake I see when it comes to glute activation is this idea of doing these open chain exercises where we are either keeping our feet off of the ground or we are doing some sort of glute drill banded where we're just trying to get that thing to burn. And again, we know that the burning is not necessarily correlated with the outcome that we want. Now, if we are going to do something to recruit the glutes, we need to think about when the glute is actually going to work. The glute max, the big butt muscle, has a lot of leverage to work, in particular when the pelvis is in an internally rotated position right here, moving to an externally rotated position like so. This mimics mid stance of gait, and this is pushing off once we drive off of that stance leg onto the other side. When our leg is in the air and we're going through swing in movement, swing phase of gait or running, the glute's not working. At least I hope not. It will be working eccentrically and elongating, but it should not be working to the extent where there's a contraction actually happening. The glute max will be working when the foot is on the ground. So I think we should probably consider the idea of working the glute max and activating it or facilitating its recruitment when the foot is secure to the ground. If you read any gait textbook, you're going to see that there is a correlation between late stance and mid stance mechanics and the glute max firing. Let's visualize that on the foot model. We strike the ground on the lateral border of our heel right here. Transition to more of the inside edge of our foot where we pronate and then we push off. Push off occurs right here. Push off and late stance occurs on the ball of the big toe primarily. So that's when our glute needs to work to push us. back to the other side. So if we're going to do something that requires the glute to work and we want to optimally recruit it to re-educate better movement, then we probably want that reference happening at that specific point in our foot. And then we would want to recruit the glute in a position where we are feeling that foot reference and we can leverage that sensation. The third most common mistake I see with recruiting the glutes is trying to jam the knees outside of the toes at all times. Let's go back to the original point and think about why that would be. So if I'm in a squat, or I'm doing a sumo deadlift or something like that, and I'm trying to jam my knees really far out, what's that going to do to my pelvis? It's going to do this. It's going to externally rotate my pelvis like so, which is going to put my glutes in an end range state, which is going to limit their potential recruitment, because if we think about the stretch to contract principle, then we're not going to be maximizing that. There's actually been some really good data put out by guys like Cassian Hansen at N1 Education that have looked at the recruitment patterns of muscles when we are in different stances. When we are shoving our knees outside of our toes, or we're doing a very wide stance squat or a wide stance deadlift, we're actually going to be recruiting more adductors, which is our groin muscles in here, because these wider feet give those muscles, which attach in here, more leverage to do this, because our knees are so far outside. When we keep the knees in line with the toes and we do more of a narrow stance squat or a narrow stance leg press, that allows for that tracking to occur so the pelvis can go through all those motions. So if you want to recruit your glutes as much as you can, then I would probably consider doing a lot more narrower stance activities than wide stance, which is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because they think that if their feet are really wide, they're squeezing their butt, then that means that they're gonna be feeling a lot more glutes. And they are, but that doesn't mean it's more effective for recruitment and breaking down the muscle to build it. Here is one exercise from Postural Restoration Institute that I think is much more effective for recruiting the glutes and having that carry over to movement and restoring movement and posture, rather than just a traditional clamshell like you might see. There's nothing necessarily wrong with the clamshell, but I think that we can do something a little bit more targeted to help us recruit the glute in a more specific position to how we move. This is the 90-90 side lying knee toward knee activity. To set up for this, you need some sort of object, a pillow, an Airex pad, a little towel rolled up underneath your bottom side oblique. And that's gonna help you side bend to that side and get a little bit of abs on that side as well when you breathe through this. Secondly, you want your hips and knees bent at a 90-degree angle, and you also want this leg in line with the level of the top hip. To start this exercise, give yourself a slight posterior pelvic tilt, nice, and then feel both feet flat on that wall. Now, push this right knee ahead of the left, good, and then turn it up towards the ceiling. We want to feel this reference of the inner edge of the foot on the top foot, and that's gonna help us recruit the glute right here on that top side. Now, as he's holding this position, not losing sense of his arch on the right side in this instance, he's gonna keep this knee pushing into my hand and high, and then lift that left knee to meet it. This is quite challenging, and the hardest part of this exercise is to keep his knee pushing into my hand while lifting the left knee up. Now, if he can't do that and get the left knee all the way up, that's okay. Just have the intention to. And if you can only get it a millimeter off of the ground, that's okay. You're still getting the same adaptations from this exercise that we're going for. The number one thing I see people struggle with on this activity is not feeling the glute on the top side. And that's usually a consequence of being leaned too far back right here. So I would encourage you to get closer, bring your trunk closer to your knees. Beautiful. You want to be right at 90. If even just a little bit less than 90 can be a little bit beneficial here. So maybe even get to 80 degrees, and that'll help you get a reference to really leverage the ability to push this foot arch into the wall. Now, once you got that right glute, push that right knee forward. Good. Push the right knee up. Very nice. Now, he's gonna lift that knee up and he should be able to keep that right glute. The other thing that we see in this exercise that's a common mistake is feeling too much of the TFL muscle. That's the muscle that runs down the side of your leg right here. It's not near your glute, it's more like right here. If you feel that on the bottom side leg as opposed to the inner thigh, that's probably because you're arching your back too much. You're going into too much extension, so you want to keep a slight tuck, and that's going to allow you to leverage the inner groin rather than that outside hip. And again, there's nothing wrong with working a muscle in an in-range position. If you wanted to work the hip extension fibers of the glute max specifically, then you don't actually want to go that deep into hip flexion. You actually probably want to spend relatively more time in hip extension, and that's totally okay. But again, I think we should be focusing on more so the wall reference and getting that carryover, creating that association between our brain, the foot on a firm surface, and that glute working when we want. Here's one way you can do that as well. This activity is the prone propulsion drill. The purpose of this activity is to get us to push off of one side. While this wall acts as the floor, imagine that we're pushing off with one leg and then accepting the weight into the other side. That is essentially what this drill is training. So it's kind of like gait and running, but just on the ground. To set up in this position, Kyle, I'm gonna have you start on all fours just like you are now. Now I want you to take one leg back, doesn't matter which, you'll do both sides here. And then you wanna have this leg be about 90% locked out. And a slight bend in the knee is exactly what we're looking for there. If that leg is totally locked out, it's gonna limit your glute recruitment. So we just want a slight bend of the knee, feel the whole foot flat. And now I want him to drop that right hip slightly lower than the left. Not a ton, but just slightly. And he should feel a little bit of his left inner groin, his left adductor turn on. Now I want you to drop down to your elbows, keeping your elbows directly underneath your shoulders. Good. Now he should have left groin still and maybe a little bit of right glute. Now to get even more glute, I want him to extend his back. Let everything sink down. Now slightly tuck your hips. Perfect. You see how subtle that was? That's exactly what we want. He should have a lot of lower right butt cheek now, feeling his heel press into that wall, but the whole foot is still flat. So now he's got right glute, left inner thigh, and now he's going to slightly push into my hand right here to bring his ribs back closer to the ceiling, but he's not slouching. Now I want you to exhale, big open mouth. So now he's got left inner thigh, right glute max, and now he's gonna exhale through your mouth until you feel those abdominals, those side abdominals, specifically the obliques engage. And you're probably gonna feel your left one a little bit more than your right one here. Hold on to that as you inhale. And you'll feel some expansion in your back here, as well as a little bit in your chest. Common mistakes you see in this activity are too much shifting of the hip that's on the wall down. When that happens, we lose the groin on the other side, and you're also gonna fall off to the side a little bit too much. So we wanna make sure that we're not dropping that hip excessively. It's just a little bit. This pelvis is gonna be definitely lower than this pelvis, but it needs to be just subtle. Also, we see a little bit of collapsing right here of the upper back, and then you're going to be extending your upper thoracic spine as opposed to pushing into my hand a little bit, getting a little bit of retraction, which sets it in a more neutral position. And finally, the last thing we see in this exercise as a common mistake is too much rounding of the low back. Remember how we cued a slight tuck? If we over tuck, then we're gonna lose leverage of our glute and also the groin on the down leg. If you wanted to work your glute max through more of hip extension, then you could do something like a hinge activity, like so, where you are going through a hinge to stretch out the back glute like so, and then propelling upward, which is going to help you close that and take that muscle through a full range of motion through the pelvis.